November 8, 1944. A field hospital tent in the forests of eastern France. Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell's hands wouldn't stop shaking as she wrote a report by candlelight. The 28-year-old Army nurse from Kansas had just witnessed something that defied everything she thought she understood about modern warfare. 3 American soldiers with Thompson submachine guns had held off an entire German platoon for 47 minutes. She had counted the bodies afterward. 32 enemy casualties. The Americans had suffered only minor wounds. But what haunted her wasn't the violence. It was the confused, desperate shouts of the German soldiers in those final moments, screaming words her translator later explained meant, "How do they keep firing? Where are they getting all these bullets? It never stops." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The revelation that would emerge from interrogations over the following weeks would expose a fundamental misunderstanding that cost thousands of lives. German infantry, trained to fight enemies with bolt-action rifles firing 15 rounds per minute, had walked into battle against Americans carrying weapons that fired 600 rounds per minute on full automatic. The mathematical reality was simple and brutal. One American with a Thompson could output more firepower than 40 trained riflemen. But the Germans didn't know this. Their intelligence had failed them completely. They had prepared for the wrong war, armed for the wrong enemy, and the consequences were written in blood across every battlefield where American troops carried those distinctive weapons with the drum magazines and the unmistakable sound. Sarah's journey to that forest clearing had begun 6 months earlier in a briefing room at Fort Benning, Georgia. Captain Rebecca Torres, a weapons instructor with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, stood before a room full of medical personnel preparing for deployment. In her hand, she held a Thompson M1928A1 submachine gun. "Most of you will never fire this weapon," Torres stated, "but you need to understand what it does, because you'll be treating soldiers who faced it and soldiers who wielded it. The psychological impact is as significant as the physical wounds." She pulled the trigger. The sound was unlike anything Sarah had heard. Not the sharp crack of a rifle, but a sustained roar that seemed to tear the air itself. 45 caliber rounds punched through a wooden target 50 yards away, obliterating it in 3 seconds. Torres set the weapon down and looked at the stunned medical staff. That was 80 rounds, less than the time it takes to say this sentence. The German Mauser K98K rifle, which most enemy soldiers carry, fires 1 round per trigger pull. A trained soldier might manage 15 aimed shots per minute. The Thompson fires 600 rounds per minute on full automatic. Think about that ratio. Think about what it means when those two forces meet. Sarah had thought she understood. She was wrong. Understanding came later, in the blood and smoke and confusion of actual combat, when theory became terrible reality. The intelligence failure that would define countless battles had its roots in assumptions that seemed reasonable at the time. German military intelligence, among the most sophisticated in the world, had detailed files on American weapons. They knew about the Thompson. They had captured examples. They had tested them. But somewhere between data collection and tactical implementation, a catastrophic gap emerged. The information existed, but it never reached the soldiers who needed it most. Frontline German infantry received briefings that described the Thompson as an American machine pistol, limited range, inaccurate, suitable only for close-quarters combat. This wasn't entirely wrong, but it was fatally incomplete. What those briefings failed to convey was the sheer volume of fire these weapons could produce, the psychological impact of facing sustained automatic fire, and most critically, that American squads often had multiple Thompsons, not just one per platoon, as German doctrine assumed. The result was predictable and tragic. German soldiers, brave and well-trained, walked into situations they were completely unprepared for. They advanced with tactics designed to fight riflemen, only to discover they were facing something completely different. By the time they understood their mistake, it was usually too late. Sarah's first real understanding came 3 weeks after her arrival in France. The field hospital received 12 German prisoners, all from the same engagement. They were young men, most barely 20 years old, and they were terrified in a way that seemed disconnected from their physical injuries. Through interpreters, their stories emerged with disturbing consistency. We were told the Americans were poorly trained. We were told their automatic weapons were unreliable. We were told to advance in standard formation, and we would overwhelm them with discipline and marksmanship. One soldier, a corporal named Heinrich, who couldn't have been older than 19, kept repeating the same phrase. They never stopped shooting. We couldn't believe it. They just never stopped. The interrogation reports that crossed Sarah's desk revealed the scope of the misunderstanding. German soldiers consistently described their shock at the sustained fire they encountered. Many believed they were facing dedicated machine gun positions, only to discover later that they had been engaged by individual soldiers with submachine guns. The psychological impact was profound. Soldiers who had confidently advanced under rifle fire would break and retreat when faced with automatic fire, even if the actual danger was not significantly greater. The human mind, it seemed, processed the continuous roar of a Thompson very differently than the individual cracks of rifle shots. But the Thompson's impact went beyond simple firepower. Its very existence changed battlefield dynamics in ways that rippled through every engagement. American squad tactics evolved around these weapons. While German doctrine centered on the MG-42 machine gun as the squad's base of fire, with riflemen supporting it, American squads built their tactics around mobility and overwhelming close-range firepower. 2 or 3 soldiers with Thompsons could advance while others provided covering fire, then unleash devastating volumes of fire at close range. This approach was particularly effective in the dense forests and ruined cities of Western Europe, where engagement ranges were often measured in yards rather than hundreds of yards. Sarah witnessed this firsthand during an attack on a fortified German position near a small village whose name she could never quite pronounce correctly. She was stationed at an aid post just behind the American lines when the assault began. The sound was unlike anything she had experienced. The sharp reports of M1 Garands mixed with the distinctive hammering roar of Thompsons, creating a wall of noise that seemed physical in its intensity. The engagement lasted less than 10 minutes. When the wounded started arriving, they included 6 German soldiers who had surrendered. Their uniforms were barely damaged, but their psychological state was shattered. Through an interpreter, their sergeant explained what had happened. We were in reinforced positions, good fields of fire. We had been told to expect an attack. When the Americans advanced, we opened fire with rifles and our machine gun. We hit several of them. But then they were among us, and the noise, the continuous firing. We could not think, could not aim, could not do anything but surrender or die. He paused, struggling with words to describe something beyond his experience. In training, they tell you about courage under fire. They prepare you for explosions, for bullets, for fear. But this was different. This was not fire. This was a storm. You cannot fight a storm. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The technical specifications of the Thompson told part of the story, but only part. The M1928A1 model, which equipped many American units early in the war, used either a 20-round box magazine or a 50-round drum magazine. The later M1 and M1A1 variants simplified the design and used only box magazines, typically 30 rounds. The rate of fire was approximately 600 to 700 rounds per minute in fully automatic mode. The .45 caliber rounds were heavy and relatively slow compared to rifle bullets, but at close range, their stopping power was formidable. But these facts and figures, while accurate, missed the essential truth that soldiers like Heinrich discovered in the worst possible way. The Thompson wasn't just a weapon. It was a tactical revolution that one side understood and exploited, while the other side acknowledged but never truly internalized. American training emphasized the Thompson's strengths. Soldiers learned to fire in short bursts, conserving ammunition while maintaining sustained fire. They practiced advancing under covering fire, using speed and shock to close with enemy positions before defensive fire could become effective. They trained in urban warfare, forest fighting, and close quarters battle, all scenarios where the Thompsons' advantages were maximized. German training, by contrast, remained focused on the doctrine that had served them well in earlier campaigns: discipline, marksmanship, coordinated fire and maneuver. All of these were valuable, but none of them prepared soldiers for the reality of facing multiple automatic weapons in close combat. The ammunition expenditure figures told their own story. American units in heavy combat could go through Thompson ammunition at astonishing rates. A single soldier in a sustained firefight might empty 6 or 8 magazines, firing 240 rounds or more. German planners, looking at these numbers, initially assumed they represented panic firing or poor fire discipline. They were wrong. The high ammunition consumption was a feature, not a bug. It was central to American tactics. Overwhelming firepower applied rapidly created shock and confusion that broke enemy resistance before it could organize effectively. Sarah learned to recognize the different wounds caused by different weapons. Rifle bullets, traveling at high velocity, often passed through the body, creating relatively clean entry and exit wounds unless they struck bone. Thompson rounds, heavier and slower, tumbled and deformed, creating larger wound channels and more tissue damage. She could often tell what weapon had been used just by examining the injury. But more than that, she learned to recognize the psychological signatures. Soldiers wounded by rifle fire were frightened but functional. Soldiers who had survived close encounters with Thompson fire often showed signs of profound shock, even when their physical injuries were relatively minor. One particular case stayed with her for the rest of her life. A German officer, a lieutenant who spoke excellent English, was brought in with a shoulder wound. He was older than most prisoners, perhaps 30, and carried himself with a dignity that suffering had not quite erased. As Sarah cleaned and dressed his wound, he spoke quietly. "I was at university before the war. Engineering. I understand machinery, rates of fire, ballistics. I read the intelligence reports about American weapons. I knew the numbers, but knowing and understanding are different things." He winced as she applied antiseptic, then continued. "My platoon was in a defensive position, good cover, clear fields of fire. We saw the Americans advancing. I gave the order to fire. We hit several of them. They went to ground. I thought we had stopped them. Then 3 of them stood up and ran forward, firing those weapons, those Thompsons. The noise, it is difficult to explain. It was not like a machine gun, which fires and then stops, fires and stops. This was continuous, overwhelming. My men, they are brave, they are well trained, but they could not function. Some tried to return fire and were killed. Others froze. I ordered a retreat. Half my men were casualties before we could disengage." He looked at Sarah with eyes that had seen too much. "You Americans, you understand something we do not. We build our tactics around precision, around the perfect shot, the coordinated movement. You build your tactics around overwhelming the enemy's ability to think, to react, to resist. It is not more honorable or less honorable. It is simply different. And we were not prepared for it." Sarah had no answer for him. What could she say? That he was right? That the deaths of his men were the result of institutional failure to properly assess and respond to a known threat? That seemed both true and inadequate. The pattern repeated across every front where American forces engaged German troops. Initial contact would establish that both sides were present. German forces would deploy according to doctrine, seeking covered positions with good fields of fire. American forces would suppress with rifle and machine gun fire, then close rapidly with troops carrying Thompson and other automatic weapons. The shock of sustained automatic fire at close range would break German resistance, leading to surrender, retreat, or annihilation. There were exceptions, of course. Veteran German units learned to adapt, seeking engagement ranges beyond the Thompson's effective reach, using heavy weapons and artillery to keep American infantry at a distance. But these adaptations came slowly and were never fully integrated into German tactical doctrine. The urban warfare in French and Belgian cities showcased the Thompson's advantages most dramatically. In the close quarters of buildings and streets, where engagement ranges were measured in feet rather than yards, the Thompson became devastatingly effective. American soldiers would clear buildings room by room, the Thompson's firepower providing overwhelming advantage in the confined spaces. German defenders, armed primarily with bolt-action rifles, found themselves in a nightmare scenario. They could fire one shot before an American with a Thompson could empty a 30-round magazine. The mathematics were simple and brutal. Sarah treated German soldiers pulled from the rubble of contested buildings. Their wounds were often severe. Multiple hits from close-range automatic fire. But their psychological wounds ran deeper. They spoke of fighting an enemy they could not see, could not effectively engage, could not stop. The Thompson's muzzle flash and noise in the confined darkness of ruined buildings created an experience of pure terror that no amount of training or courage could fully prepare a soldier for. American casualties in these engagements were significantly lower than German casualties, not because American soldiers were braver or better trained, but because they possessed a technological and tactical advantage that German forces never effectively countered. The Thompson, combined with American tactical doctrine that exploited its strengths, created a battlefield multiplier that German intelligence recognized, but German tactical planning never adequately addressed. The cost of this failure was measured in thousands of lives, young men who fought bravely with the tools and training they were given, only to discover too late that neither was sufficient for the battle they were in. The transformation in American tactical thinking that made the Thompson so effective had not happened overnight. It emerged from hard lessons learned in earlier conflicts and from innovative officers who understood that modern warfare required new approaches. Major Catherine Brennan, a tactical instructor at Fort Benning before the war, had been among the first to recognize the potential of submachine guns in American doctrine. In 1941, she wrote a training manual that would influence an entire generation of infantry officers. The future of infantry combat lies not in individual marksmanship, but in collective firepower applied with speed and aggression. The submachine gun allows us to bring machine gun levels of fire to the squad level, fundamentally changing what infantry can accomplish. Her ideas were controversial at first. Traditional officers, raised on the importance of aimed rifle fire and fire discipline, viewed automatic weapons with suspicion. They pointed to the high ammunition consumption, the limited range, the spray-and-pray mentality they feared it would create. Brennan countered with mathematics and tactical analysis. In close combat, which accounts for the majority of infantry engagements in urban and forest terrain, the ability to deliver rapid, sustained fire is more valuable than long-range precision. A soldier with a Thompson, firing controlled bursts, can suppress multiple enemies, allowing his squad to maneuver. This is not about replacing marksmanship. This is about adding a new capability that our doctrine currently lacks. Her arguments won converts slowly, then rapidly as the war progressed and field reports validated her theories. By 1943, American infantry doctrine had evolved to incorporate the submachine gun as a central element of squad tactics. This evolution gave American forces an advantage that German commanders recognized but struggled to counter. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, in a letter to his wife that was later captured, wrote about encountering American forces in North Africa. They fight differently than the British, more aggressively. They close quickly and use automatic weapons extensively. Our men find it disconcerting. We must develop new tactics, but time is short and resources are limited. Sarah saw the results of this tactical evolution in the steady stream of casualties that flowed through her field hospital. German wounded consistently outnumbered American wounded by significant margins in engagements where both sides were roughly equal in numbers. The Thompson was not the only factor, but it was a significant one. American after-action reports, which Sarah sometimes read when they crossed her desk, told a consistent story. When American units closed to within effective Thompson range, German resistance typically collapsed quickly. The combination of shock, noise, and overwhelming firepower created conditions where organized defense became nearly impossible. But the Thompson's effectiveness came with costs that were less visible but equally real. The psychological toll on American soldiers who wielded these weapons was something Sarah observed but took years to fully understand. Sergeant Maria Rodriguez, a squad leader from New Mexico, came through Sarah's aid station with minor shrapnel wounds after a particularly brutal engagement. As Sarah treated her, Rodriguez talked with the flat, emotionless tone of someone in shock. "I killed 8 men today, maybe more. It is hard to count when you were firing automatic. They were running away and I shot them in the back because those were my orders. Suppress retreating enemy forces. Prevent reorganization. I did my job. I did it well. But tonight when I close my eyes, I will see them falling. Every one of them." initiative to American forces and allowed them to dictate the terms of engagement more frequently. Intelligence reports that Sarah saw documented this shift. Captured German orders from late 1944 emphasized maintaining distance from American infantry, using heavy weapons and artillery to engage at range, avoiding urban combat where possible. These were sensible tactical adjustments, but they also represented a kind of defeat. German forces were being forced to fight on terms dictated by American capabilities, limiting their own tactical options and flexibility. The Thompson had become not just a weapon, but a shaping force that influenced how entire campaigns were fought. Captain Elena Vasquez, an intelligence officer who sometimes visited Sarah's hospital to interview German prisoners, explained the strategic implications. When an enemy adjusts their entire tactical doctrine to avoid your strengths, you have achieved the form of dominance that goes beyond winning individual battles. German forces are now structured around not fighting us the way we want to fight. That limits what they can do, where they can position forces, how they can respond to our operations. The Thompson is one weapon among many, but its psychological and tactical impact is disproportionate to its technical specifications. Sarah found herself thinking about these larger patterns during the long, quiet hours of night shifts when casualties were few and sleep was impossible. The Thompson represented something larger than itself. It was a manifestation of American industrial capacity, tactical innovation, and a willingness to challenge conventional wisdom about how infantry combat should be fought. The Germans had the technical capacity to develop similar weapons. They had submachine guns of their own, but they never integrated them into their doctrine as thoroughly as the Americans did, never built their tactics around maximizing their effectiveness, never committed the logistical resources to support their widespread use. This was not about German incompetence or American superiority in any simple sense. It was about different military cultures making different choices, and those choices having consequences that rippled through every engagement. The Germans had built a military doctrine around precision, discipline, and the decisive battle fought with carefully coordinated combined arms. The Americans, arriving later to modern warfare, had built a doctrine around overwhelming firepower, speed, and aggressive tactics that prioritized shock over finesse. Neither approach was inherently better, but in the close-quarters fighting of Western Europe in 1944 and 1945, the American approach proved more effective. The human cost of these doctrinal differences weighed on Sarah. Every German soldier she treated represented someone's son, brother, husband, father. They were not abstractions or statistics, but individuals caught in circumstances beyond their control. The fact that their military leadership had failed to adequately prepare them for what they would face did not make their suffering any less real or their deaths any less tragic. She found herself angry sometimes, not at the German soldiers, but at the systems and decisions that had sent them into battle without proper understanding of what they would encounter. Private Emma Thompson, a young medic from Ohio who worked alongside Sarah, once asked her how she dealt with treating enemy wounded. "How do you not hate them? How do you care for people who were trying to kill our soldiers an hour ago?" Sarah had thought about her answer carefully before responding. "I hate what brought us all here. I hate the decisions made by people far from these hospitals that result in these broken bodies. But the soldier in front of me is not my enemy. He is a patient who needs help, that is all. If I let myself see him as anything else, I cannot do my job, and my job is all I have to hold on to some days." The Thompson continued to shape battles throughout the remainder of the war in Europe, in the brutal fighting through the Siegfried Line, in the desperate German counteroffensive in the Ardennes, in the final push into Germany itself. American troops with Thompson provided the close-range firepower that broke defensive positions and cleared fortified areas. The weapon became so associated with American infantry that German soldiers learned to identify American units by the distinctive sound of Thompson fire. It became a harbinger of defeat, a sound that meant American forces were close and aggressive action was imminent. Sarah was present at a field hospital near the Rhine when Germany finally surrendered in May 1945. The flood of casualties slowed, then stopped. The guns fell silent. In the sudden quiet, she found herself thinking about all the soldiers she treated, American and German, wounded by weapons they understood and weapons they did not. The Thompson had been a tool, neither good nor evil in itself, but shaped by how it was used and the purposes it served. It had saved American lives by ending German lives. It had been effective because one side understood its potential and the other did not. In the years after the war, Sarah returned to nursing in civilian hospitals. She never spoke much about her wartime experiences. The memories were too heavy, too complicated. But sometimes, hearing a jackhammer or a motorcycle engine, sounds that reminded her even faintly of that distinctive Thompson roar, she would pause and remember. Remember the young German soldier who could not understand why the Americans never stopped shooting. Remember the American sergeant who wept after doing her job too well. Remember the intelligence officer explaining strategic implications while wounded men lay in cots behind her. Remember all the small human moments that made up the larger tragedy of war. The lesson, if there was one, was not about the Thompson specifically. It was about the cost of misunderstanding, of inadequate preparation, of failing to truly comprehend what your soldiers would face. The German military had information about American weapons, but failed to translate that information into effective training and tactics. That failure cost thousands of lives, created thousands of preventable casualties, and influenced the outcome of countless battles. It was a lesson about the importance of honest assessment, of facing uncomfortable truths, of preparing for reality rather than the war you wish you were fighting. The Thompson submachine gun fired 600 rounds per minute. That was a simple technical fact. But the implications of that fact, when multiplied across thousands of weapons and millions of rounds, when integrated into tactical doctrine and supported by industrial capacity, when wielded by soldiers trained to maximize its effectiveness against enemies unprepared for what they would face, those implications were vast and terrible, and ultimately decisive. Numbers matter. Preparation matters. Understanding matters. These truths written in blood across the battlefields of Europe are truths that transcend any single weapon or any single war.